The hydraulic scream of the manipulator arm was not a sound of work, but a sound of metal fatigue under crushing duress. Rowan Fell forced his breath inward, shallowly, through the recycled air system of his suit, the filtering unit struggling to keep pace with the sulfurous vapor rising from the shaft below. He was descending into the chasm of Vale, Sector 5, sub-level 290, a place where the air pressure alone was meant to be fatal. His visor was cracked, spiderwebbed with fine stress lines, giving the world a jittery, fragmented appearance. 5 seconds. That was the window he had to anchor the primary magnetic patch before the fissure expanded beyond manageable limits. Failure meant a pressure cascade that would gut the mining colony for 3 kilometers, rendering 10,000 souls dependent on emergency life support. Failure also meant the complete and irreversible end of the extraction program, and Rowan knew that in the cold calculus of Relith, life support for 10,000 was considered an unacceptable long-term expense. His gloves, thick and insulated, swam in static energy. The heat radiating from the open fracture was intense, smelling of burnt plastic and superheated iron, the signature odor of industrial self-destruction. Rowan tasted bile in his throat, a sharp, bitter tang amplified by the oxygen mixture. This wasn't just a repair, it was an exercise in penance. "Status Fell?" The comms crackled, the voice belonging to Supervisory Technician Bryn Halstead, sharp and detached. "Cycling nitrogen purge, Bryn. Stress levels on the main frame are reading 0.78. It's screaming. The patch won't hold for long." Rowan fought the urge to wipe the sweat from his eyes, knowing the gesture would only smear the inner lens of the visor further. "It has to hold. Command is diverting the energy flow now. You get 1 shot at placement. 0 margin for error, Rowan." 0 margin for error. Rowan heard the words and felt the familiar heavy weight settle in his gut. A leaden anchor dropped years ago. The official inquiry into the catastrophic collapse of the Vale 3 thermal spire had used that exact phrase. 0 margin for error. They needed a culprit, and the engineer who questioned the mandated materials was always easier to sacrifice than the procurement officer who signed off on the cheapened alloys. The court-martial had lasted 3 weeks, ripping apart his career, his reputation, and his life, concluding that the failure was due to his negligence in supervisory monitoring, not the structural flaw he had repeatedly flagged in triplicate. They buried him alive in punitive assignments like this one, deep in the Earth's toxic crust, fixing the very wounds caused by the incompetence he had pointed out. Injustice on Relith was rarely violent. It was systemic, slow, and poisoned everything it touched. He focused on the data feed overlay. The magnetic patch, a 12-ton plate of high-density chromidium, was swinging into position on the failing beam. The fissure pulsed, a bright orange scar in the deep gray rock. "Initiating phase sequence 3, Rowan reported, his voice tight. "Activating primary magnetic adhesion, now." A deep grinding hum vibrated through his bones, followed by a shockwave that nearly unseated him from his harness. The patch slammed home. The thermal signature stabilized almost instantly. Relief was not a sudden rush, but a slow, agonizing abatement of physical strain. He sagged, taking the first deep, ragged breath he had allowed himself in 5 minutes. The air tasted of ozone and deep, cold rock. "Confirmed seal," Bryn's voice reported, slightly calmer. "Pressure stabilization confirmed. Stand by for secondary anchor deployment." Rowan began the agonizing process of securing the patch with molecular bonding agents, the chemical stench filling the tiny space inside his helmet. As he worked, he activated the deep scan sonar array, cross-referencing the sealed fissure with the surrounding rock structure. He was not required to do this. His job was complete. But curiosity, or perhaps the obsessive need to prove the historical record wrong, drove him. The sonar data painted a map of the surrounding bedrock, but the colors were wrong. Not localized fault lines, but geometric, engineered weaknesses. He zoomed in on the stress lines 20 meters away from the repaired site. "Bryn," Rowan murmured, his voice low enough that it bordered on breaking the communication threshold. "The structural integrity report for this sector. Pull the original specifications from the hegemony audit, cycle 6. A moment of silence passed, heavy with implied insubordination. That data is classified, Rowan, above your clearance grade. Then bypass it. Use the secondary encryption key from the Val 3 court transcripts, the one the prosecution redacted. I need to see the projected stress tolerances for alloy 27 beta. Bryn hesitated. She was fiercely loyal, but also a product of the system. Rowan, what are you looking for? Proof that this failure was inevitable. This isn't a single break, Bryn. It's a network. Look at the way the secondary veins are radiating. They're too linear, too organized for natural tectonic strain. They look manufactured. He waited, counting the slow, deliberate seconds. He could hear the faint high whine of her accessing restricted files, the quiet snap of internal digital locks being overridden. She was risking her own precarious position to run a ghost query. Then, her breathing shifted in the comms, a sharp intake of air, followed by a profound silence that eclipsed the low industrial thrum of the station. Rowan, Bryn whispered, the detachment entirely gone. The 27 beta alloy specifications. They were downgraded by 60% capacity 2 cycles before deployment. They knew this material couldn't hold the long-term stress. They used it anyway. Rowan felt the sudden hot flush of adrenaline despite the cold of the shaft. It wasn't just negligence. It was economic triage disguised as engineering. They had deliberately built failure into the foundation to maximize short-term yield, treating human lives and critical infrastructure as expendable metrics in a resource equation. The hegemony requires an ecological mitigation specialist. Rowan recalled the recent strange Quranic presence on Relith. The aliens were known for their rigid, crystalline logic, but they were fundamentally blind to the messy political deceit inherent in Terran internal affairs. The Quranic believed human life was an inefficiency. Relithian command seemed to agree, but only when it served their profit margins. Suddenly, a new feed flashed across his visor overlay, unrequested and originating from outside the planetary network. It was high-level Quranic surveillance data, routed through a military proxy he recognized as being associated with Ambassador Thraxis's logistical command. A new face appeared in a small data window. Ulzeth, a Quranic monitoring agent, his ocular cluster focused entirely on the live thermal feed of Rowan's repair site. The alien was not analyzing the engineering, it was analyzing the human response. Communication log, Ulzeth, Ethelred Command. Subject, Terran Efficiency Metrics, Sector 47 Gamma. Observation, Unit Fel, Relithian Extraction Force. Performance exceeding 5 sigma deviation from expected resource prioritization. Repair achieved with 87% less resource expenditure than programmed protocols. Analysis. The Terran element exhibits extreme resilience under systemic failure parameters. However, the internal political structure is defined by deliberate self-sabotage for short-term financial yield. This inefficiency index is unstable. Recommendation: further study required on how Terran units maintain functionality when actively aware of institutional betrayal. The message vanished, leaving only the cold echo of its assessment. Rowan stared at the empty space on his visor. The Quranic hegemony wasn't observing Relith because of its strength. They were cataloging the weakness, the deliberate, manufactured flaws that underpinned Terran civilization. They weren't fighting humans. They were studying the data points of our failure. Bryn's voice brought him back, frantic now. Rowan, get out of there. They've detected the query bypass. Security teams are incoming. Rowan knew he couldn't leave the evidence behind. The original structural specifications that condemned him and this entire sector were now floating in Bryn's temporary cache. If he left, the information would be wiped, the injustice sealed forever. He unclipped a small, heavily shielded storage unit from his belt. Bryn, I need you to transfer the logs, all of them, not to my local drive, to my encrypted storage unit. Route it through the 27 beta alloy signature. Use the error code as the hash key. Rowan, that will take 45 seconds minimum, and you're still 80 meters down. They're sealing the access hatch. I know the timer, Bryn. You warned me about zero margin for error. Now, give me the weapon to fight back. He could hear the distinct sound of heavy military boots stomping on the grating far above. The noise was amplified by the resonant steel of the shaft, a brutal rhythm of institutional oppression closing in. Rowan braced himself against the heat of the freshly sealed wall, the physical pressure of the shaft now mirroring the immense crushing weight of the conspiracy descending upon him. He had fixed the fissure in the earth, but the systemic betrayal, the real fracture, remained wide open, demanding a price far steeper than the lost deuterium. He waited, 45 seconds feeling like 45 years, the heat from the ruptured earth pressing against his cracked visor, breathing the foul air and waiting for the click that would deliver either salvation or eternal condemnation. The click, when it finally came, was anticlimactic, not the solid thunk of data transfer completion, but a subtle, low-frequency electrical spike that caused the air quality display on Rowan's visor to momentarily flicker into a frantic red hash. Transmission complete. Confirmation hash matches the error code. Bryn breathed, her voice ragged with fear and exertion. It's on the drive, Rowan. Now, move. The 45 seconds had ended, but the weight did not lift. Instead, the distant drumming of boots intensified, now accompanied by a sharp, high-pitched whine, the sound of plasma cutters warming up, preparing to breach the 80-meter shaft. They were not waiting for him to ascend. They intended to cut him out of the structure, treating him less like a human and more like structural debris to be removed. Rowan clipped the storage unit securely to the innermost layer of his suit. The physical object was no larger than a thumb, yet it held the systemic failure of an entire mining sector, the proof of negligence disguised as profit. It was the only counterweight he possessed against the crushing inevitability of the Relithian Command's justice. He began the ascent, but his mind raced far ahead of his straining body. The system wasn't just corrupt, it was actively self-cannibalizing, prioritizing quarterly metrics over long-term stability. The Quranic agent Ulzeth had correctly identified the fracture. Terran units maintaining functionality when actively aware of institutional betrayal. It was the human superpower, continuing to function perfectly within a fundamentally broken machine. His hands, still vibrating faintly from the magnetic patch activation, found the cold steel rungs of the ladder bolted to the shaft wall. The heat radiating from the repair site at his back fought with the sudden, penetrating chill descending from the upper levels. The temperature differential created a sharp, unpleasant fog inside his helmet, reducing visibility further. "They are cutting through the first access point," Bryn reported, the sound of the plasma torch a visceral, spitting roar now. "You have 60 seconds until breach. Estimated time to reach the upper hatch is 2 minutes." Rowan was trapped. He was moving upward into an ambush, 80 meters of vertical ascent, separating him from the cold light of day and the waiting security team. He forced himself to stop, resting his weight momentarily on the ladder, his muscles screaming. His lungs burned with the effort, the filtered air tasting metallic, not from blood, but from the ozone generated by the intense electromagnetic field surrounding the shaft. "The ladder is the bottleneck," Rowan stated, his breathing loud and shallow in the comms. "They know the only way out is up. They'll wait at the hatch." "What's the alternative, Rowan? You can't go back down. The pressure is holding, but the internal heat signature is still too high. You'll cook." Rowan looked down at the orange scar he had just sealed, then upward toward the invisible hatch. The political decision, the choice of cheap alloy, had created the physical impossibility of his escape. He wasn't trapped by the rock. He was trapped by the cost-cutting protocols of his superiors. He activated his suit's local power consumption overlay. The ascent ladder led directly to the primary power conduit array for Sector 5. This array housed the emergency induction coils designed to stabilize the massive energy fluctuations required for deep core extraction. "Bryn, divert 40% of the Sector 6 auxiliary flow into the induction coil array level 2, Rowan ordered, his voice suddenly calm, detached, and authoritative, the tone of the engineer he used to be. Bryn hesitated. "Rowan, that will overload the array. It's designed to handle a 20% surge maximum. You'll fry the entire sector's power grid. We'd lose 4 days of extraction yield." "We've already lost 4 days of extraction yield when this thing cracked open," Rowan countered, and 4 days is an acceptable loss. My life is apparently not. Do it. I need interference, and I need cold. Rowan remembered the clean, precise lines of the schematics for the induction array. It was over-engineered, a rare instance of Relithian expenditure based on safety, not profit. The flaw wasn't in the design, it was in the maintenance. The coolant pumps, he knew from long, bitter experience, were chronically underserviced. If he forced a surge, the superheated coolant, a slurry of industrial ammonia and brine, would vent instantly. Not just steam, but a pressurized cloud of toxic, freezing vapor. 3 seconds to breach, Rowan, Bryn warned, the plasma cutter noise dominating the audio channel. 40%, Bryn, now! Rowan gripped the rungs, bracing for the inevitable kinetic shock. The surge hit not with a bang, but with a horrifying, sustained electrical shriek. The air around him suddenly felt charged, buzzing with uncontrolled static electricity. A moment later, the secondary pressure relief valves on the induction array failed dramatically, 70 meters above his head. The sound was a loud, tearing hiss, instantly followed by a blinding white cloud. The temperature plummeted. Rowan felt the sudden, severe chill immediately. The noxious plume of freezing ammonia slurry vented downward, transforming the 80-meter shaft into a deadly, zero-visibility wind tunnel. The synthetic fog was so dense, so sudden, that the thermal imaging on his cracked visor registered only white noise. He climbed into the cloud, relying only on muscle memory and the knowledge of the structure. The cold penetrated his suit's insulation almost instantly, numbing his fingers, turning his breath to icy vapor inside the helmet. Above, the security team had breached the hatch just as the surge hit. They would be met not by a man, but by an instantaneous blizzard of industrial poison. Rowan heard the muffled, choked screams of the security personnel through the dense interference. Not the clean sounds of combat, but the panicked gasps of men exposed to an environmental disaster they hadn't trained for. The environmental hazard specialist on Relith never used fire. They used physics. He reached the 20-meter mark. The air was thick and heavy, and the steel rungs beneath his hands were coated in a thick, sticky layer of frozen ammonia. He slipped once, his reinforced boot grating agonizingly against the steel, nearly plummeting back toward the hot core. He held on, his muscles locked into painful spasm. Keep climbing. Never stop. That was the first lesson of survival in the resource wars. When he was a boy, his father, a low-level power engineer, had once showed him a piece of metal, warped and stressed. The moment you stop resisting the pressure, his father had said, is the moment the material fails. You are the alloy, Rowan. Don't cheapen yourself. Rowan pushed past the memory, the immediate physical pain overriding all reflection. He was nearing the upper hatch, climbing over the frozen, inert forms of the security team. He stepped over the frozen legs of one man, the plasma cutter still clutched in his dead, ice-sheathed hand. The internal structure of the hatch was a graveyard of institutional arrogance. He pulled himself through the small breach the cutters had created, emerging into the main corridor of Sector 5. The silence was profound, broken only by the continuous, low thrum of the emergency generators struggling to cope with the surge. The air here was heavy with the smell of burnt insulation and chemical ice. Bryn was waiting for him, standing beside a small utility vehicle, her face pale, the stress lines around her eyes deep and pronounced. She held a heavy-gauge kinetic pistol loosely in one hand. The command just logged this as an unforeseen environmental systems failure, she whispered, her voice tight. The inquiry is already underway. They want your head for the power outage, not the logs. The logs prove the entire operation is a failure waiting to happen, Rowan said, pulling off his cracked helmet, letting the cold corridor air hit his face. The heat rash on his forehead immediately turned to stinging pins and needles. They won't want that data released. Where is the nearest extraction point? Forget extraction, Bryn said, gesturing sharply down the corridor. They sealed the primary exit. The only way off the platform is through the supply docks, 3 kilometers south, and Command has mobilized the internal tactical unit. They're faster than us, Rowan, and they have orders to seize the equipment, meaning you. Rowan looked at the utility vehicle. It was slow, cumbersome, and easily trackable. He needed speed, discretion, and a route the security protocols wouldn't flag as an escape vector. "We're not taking the vehicle," Rowan decided, moving swiftly toward a dark side corridor that reeked of stale oil and stagnant air, the ventilation shaft access points. "We're taking the undergrid maintenance tunnels." "Those are flooded and unmapped, Rowan. They haven't been used since the first cycle installation." "Exactly. If the security team thinks logically, they'll anticipate the docks. We're going to go where the Relithian budget dictated we couldn't go, through the inefficiency." He stopped abruptly at the mouth of the dark tunnel. The air here was thick, not with toxic fumes, but with the cloying, fungal scent of deep moisture and disuse, the smell of infrastructural neglect. "The Quranic are observing Bryn?" Rowan stated, glancing back down the corridor, imagining the cold, crystalline logic of Ulzeth watching from the Ethelred. They saw the calculated failure of the alloy. They now see the calculated failure of the security response. The hegemony doesn't fear our strength. They fear our willingness to break every rule just to survive their garbage. He turned back to the tunnel. "Give me a 2-minute head start. Then, you head to the surface comms hub, upload a ghost signal, a massive, randomized data packet, to the general network. Make it look like a system-wide crash. When the network is flooded, use the cover to send one small, encrypted burst out to the hegemony network. Target Ambassador Thraxus's known private frequency." Bryn's eyes widened, her pale face taut with panic. "The Quranic? Rowan, they're aliens. They'll interpret that data as an act of war, or worse. They'll exploit the weakness. They are studying our failure, Bryn, so let's give them the complete dataset," Rowan urged, stepping over the lip into the dark, cold tunnel access. He was sending the proof of Relith's systemic corruption to the one entity guaranteed to understand its fundamental, logical instability. "If I can't get this off-world, they will erase it and me. The Quranic might be our executioners, but they are also the only reliable witnesses we have." He activated the heavy magnetic lock on the access panel and plunged into the darkness. Just before the heavy steel door sealed, Bryn's horrified whisper carried through the comms. "And what do I tell them you are sending?" Rowan's response was clipped, bitter, and absolute. "Tell them it is the full, unredacted log of institutional betrayal. Tell them we are tired of fixing their intentional mistakes." The magnetic seal slammed shut. Plunging, Rowan fell into a suffocating, soundless blackness, armed only with a tiny storage drive and the cold realization that to achieve justice, he had just sold the internal fragility of human colonial politics to an alien empire. The magnetic seal slammed shut. Plunging, Rowan fell into a suffocating, soundless blackness, armed only with a tiny storage drive and the cold realization that to achieve justice, he had just sold the internal fragility of human colonial politics to an alien empire. The soundlessness was the first shock. The maintenance tunnels, unutilized for nearly 4 cycles, were supposed to hum with the residual vibration of the main platform, but the system-wide power dip had choked even the ambient noise. Rowan activated his low-power tactical light, a weak beam cutting through the oppressive thick air. The smell was pure industrial neglect, a complex mix of stagnant water, thick petroleum grease baked onto rusting pipes, and the sharp metallic tang of uncontrolled voltage arcs. He was moving not through clean infrastructure, but through a slurry of thick, black industrial runoff that reached halfway up his boots. Every step was a heavy, sucking effort. The water was lukewarm, heated by the proximity to long-forgotten geothermal pipes that had never been properly insulated. Rowan felt the heat radiating against his shins, a constant debilitating drag on his physical resources. He checked his suit power, 72% remaining. "Bryn, status on the surface network." Rowan gasped, the effort of waiting amplified by the fatigue that had set in after the ascent. Static scraped across the comms. "Ghost signal uploaded, Rowan. The network is saturated. I've initiated the transmission sequence. Target frequency locked, but the transfer rate is minimal. Too much interference from the Sector 5 core collapse." "Keep the flood up," Rowan ordered. He stopped, crouching low to peer at a tangle of old, insulated conduit spanning a narrow passage. He needed to verify the route to the geothermal bypass, but the mapping data inside his helm was obsolete, useless. He unclipped a portable magnetic field scanner from his belt, a heavy analog device dating back to the first cycle of Relith's colonization. It was designed to pierce heavy shielding and map substructural power flows, ignoring digital noise. He needed to find the path of least resistance, the path that led away from the inevitable, logical convergence of the tactical unit. Activating subsurface mapping, he informed Bryn. He pressed the induction coil against the greasy wall. The scanner whined. A high, strained sound of an antique machine pushed past its limits. The internal display flickered, displaying the expected spiderweb of power lines. But instead of the clean, geometric pathways of the schematics, the lines were fragmented, chaotic. The original engineers had simply abandoned and spliced over the old lines rather than removing them. The consequence of this institutional laziness hit him instantly. The scanner's probe, pushing against a corroded junction box, drew an unexpected surge. Not a graceful discharge, but a violent, uncontrolled electrical arc. A blinding flash erupted where the scanner met the wall, followed by a sound like tearing silk. Rowan screamed, a raw, choked sound instantly muffled by his helmet. The surge bypassed his glove insulation entirely, ripping across his forearm and slamming him backward into the warm, filthy sludge. He lay there for agonizing seconds, the heavy coil scanner sinking beside him. He dragged his arm away from the short, his muscles locking in spasm. He could smell burnt carbon and ozone, the distinctive stench of frying electronics and seared flesh. "Rowan, what happened?" Bryn's voice was frantic, momentarily cutting through the static. Rowan managed to push himself upright, resting against the grime-covered wall. His suit's integrated damage display flashed critical warnings. The arc had not only scorched his flesh, but had blown the power conduit to his right arm actuator, and, far worse, compromised the seal on his suit's emergency oxygen reserve. "Local, short," Rowan ground out, his teeth clenched against the pain. "Old conduit failure. Lost the actuator and the primary oxygen reserve seal is ruptured. Power remaining, 55%. I'm running on secondary scrubbers only." The tactical attempt had failed, not because of enemy countermeasure, but because of the deep-seated endemic decay of the Relithian infrastructure he was fighting to expose. The system was actively trying to kill him, even in its death throes. The loss of the arm actuator made maneuvering agonizing. He had to use his left arm to physically pull his deadened right arm forward through the thick water. The heat in the tunnel, previously merely uncomfortable, now became a suffocating burden as his suit struggled to regulate internal temperature with reduced power. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the drone of the emergency power, a faint, low chirp, amplified by the resonant steel of the tunnel structure. It was methodical, synthetic, and completely unlike the familiar grinding of the extraction machinery. "Bryn, I hear something. Acoustic signature? Stand by. Analyzing. Command must have rerouted the internal tactical unit. They aren't coming down the ladder. They're using specialized assets. Seismic data confirms 3 small, high-density track profiles entering the northern access branch." Rowan cursed under his breath. They were smart. The Relithian command had anticipated that a structural engineer would retreat into the structural neglect, the unmapped areas. They weren't sending men who would be slowed by the muck and heat. They were sending automated pursuit drones, engineered specifically for terrain failure. "Can you track them?" "Negative. Their magnetic shielding is too heavy. They are designed to ignore static fields." Rowan looked down at the slurry. The industrial water was too deep to crawl under, too thick to wade quickly. The air consumption warning on his visor flashed from yellow to orange. He had maybe 20 minutes of breathable air remaining if he maintained this level of exertion. He dragged himself forward, ignoring the throbbing agony in his arm. He needed to reach the main bypass junction, a massive subterranean control vault designed to handle the pressure equalization for the entire sector. If the schematics were right, the vault housed a heavy magnetic shielding plate, thick enough to mask his movement from the drone's sensors, at least temporarily. The low chirp of the track drones grew louder, closer. They were moving faster than he anticipated. 10 meters ahead, The ceiling of the tunnel looked wrong. A thick spiderweb pattern of stress cracks spanned the concrete, a direct result of the pressure spike he had forced moments earlier. The vault was directly beneath that failing section. Rowan knew the physics. The ceiling would collapse soon, funneling tons of rock and concrete into the junction. If he was caught, the pressure wave would flatten him instantly. He reached the vault's massive circular pressure door. His functional left hand fumbled with the manual release, a large, rusted wheel that had to be turned 360 degrees 20 times. 1, 2, 3. The drone chirps were now loud enough to vibrate the water at his feet. They were less than 60 seconds away. His suit power dipped to 50%. The localized static field around his data chip, the device holding the proof of betrayal, was powered by his primary reserve. If he kept turning the wheel, the exertion would drain the power further, threatening the integrity of the critical shield. Dilemma. If the shield failed, the intense electromagnetic interference radiating from the main vault's control systems would corrupt the magnetic data storage unit, scrambling the logs of institutional failure into worthless noise. The proof would be gone. If he stopped turning the wheel to reinforce the shield with the remaining power, he would be caught by the drones and the vault door would not open. Rowan felt the intense burning pain of indecision, a philosophical conflict made brutally physical. He was fighting for the truth, represented by the integrity of a few kilobytes of data, against the immediate imperative of survival. He didn't hesitate for long. The injustice was the only thing keeping him moving. Survival without the truth was just another form of systemic incarceration. Bryn, override my suit protocols. Divert 5% auxiliary power from all life support functions, heat regulation, locomotion, and dump it into the internal static shielding, Rowan ordered, his voice thin but steady. Maximize the integrity of the data core. Now. Rowan, you can't. That will take your air scrubber efficiency below 15%. You have less than 5 minutes of clean air. I am the alloy, Bryn, he stated, repeating the phrase his father taught him, a creed of relentless stubbornness. Don't cheapen me. Do it. A cold dread settled over him as the power rerouted. His suit's environmental regulation systems shut down with a faint hiss. Immediately, the heat from the pipes felt searing, but the air inside his helmet grew thick and heavy, laden with the sharp, acidic byproduct of his own panicked breathing. The carbon dioxide retention alarms flashed red. He felt momentary relief. The static shield around the data chip was holding. He resumed turning the wheel, forcing his failing body and compromised suit to complete the task. 17. 18. The ceiling above began to groan, a sickening sound of concrete giving way under unbearable load. Fine dust and pebble cascaded down, splashing into the oil-slicked water. 19. 20. The locking mechanism on the vault door shuddered, then hissed with the sound of depressurization. Rowan shoved the heavy door open, plunging into the relative dryness of the vault, just as the ceiling 20 feet behind him gave way in a deafening, terrifying roar of collapse. Rock and water slammed into the passage, creating a tidal wave of sludge and dust that would have instantly entombed him. He was inside, but the air was poisoned. His visor flashed a solid red block. Life support, critical. Oxygen depletion imminent. Rowan tore off his cracked helmet, gulping the stagnant, oily air of the vault. A temporary, fatal reprieve. He tasted metal, dust, and the cloying smell of sweat and fear. He was in the main pressure equalization vault, an immense, echoing concrete chamber crisscrossed with massive 10-meter-wide pipes. He checked his side. The data drive was safe, but the silence was wrong. There was no drone noise. The pursuit was cut off by the collapse. Rowan stumbled to a secondary maintenance panel, trying to connect to the external network just to breathe the synthesized air of the platform. The panel was dead. He leaned against a cold pipe, his lungs burning, his vision swimming with carbon dioxide poisoning. He was beaten down, injured, and trapped, running on less than 5 minutes of borrowed time. Then his blood ran cold. The emergency light fixtures in the vault, powered by an isolated geothermal shunt, began to flicker rapidly, cycling through dim red and orange hues. The flickering was not random. It was rhythmic, a coded electrical stutter that made the air feel charged and unstable. Rowan looked up at the source of the light fluctuation, a massive secondary exhaust shaft leading directly up to the open surface of Relith, sealed by a flimsy mesh security grating. The flicker ceased, settling on a steady, virulent red. Then, a sound came from the shaft above. Not the heavy tread of human boots, nor the grinding of Relithian track drones. It was a dense, low-frequency oscillation, a sound Rowan instinctively recognized from the Quranic hegemony data logs. It was the distinct signature of a deep insertion transport stabilizing its localized atmospheric interference field. A low, calm voice, heavily synthesized, cut through the emergency frequencies inside the vault, overriding the Relithian network entirely. The message was crisp, alien, and utterly final. Communication log, Ulzeth, Relith surface. Subject, Terran efficiency metrics, Sector 47 Gamma. Status, update. Data packet received from Terran Unit Bryn Halstead. Institutional betrayal confirmed. Threat prioritization reevaluated. Action, deploying specialist retrieval unit. The environment of engineered failure is now contained. Terran Unit fell as designated high-value extraction asset. Resistance from Relithian command is anticipated and will be met with immediate non-kinetic force. Rowan Fell looked up at the red-lit shaft. He hadn't just exposed the Relithian system to the hegemony, he had delivered himself into alien hands. And whatever was coming down that shaft was not concerned with justice, only with extraction. He had survived the betrayal of his own species, only to face the logical consequences of interstellar intervention. The non-kinetic force hit the vault door 20 seconds later, not as an explosive blast, but as a dense, overwhelming compression wave. The massive circular steel plate shuddered inward, groaning under a force calculated to equalize atmosphere, not destroy it. Rowan had enough time to duck behind a thick manifold pipe before the pressure spike slammed through the open doorway, scouring the air and deafening him completely. When his hearing slowly returned, it was replaced by a high, tinny ringing, like shattered glass vibrating in a vacuum. The internal lights of the vault, previously red, now cycled through a cold, sterile white. The compression had not only neutralized the atmosphere inside, but had simultaneously sterilized the air, chilling the enormous chamber instantly. Rowan shivered, the cold penetrating the compromised insulation of his suit, a profound alien chill that felt designed to inhibit thought. He stayed low, pressing his good ear against the pipe, trying to filter the white noise of the comm system. The Quranic insertion was silent, tactical, and inhumanly precise. From the secondary exhaust shaft, a single Quranic retrieval unit descended. It was not the multi-limbed, sleek diplomatic form of Ambassador Thraxus, nor the heavy armored chassis of a combat drone. This was specialized, a 6-foot bipedal mechanism of polished black alloy, impossibly thin, designed for navigation in tight industrial spaces. Its joints moved with the liquid certainty of a predator, entirely devoid of Terran mechanical noise. It held no visible weapons. The silence was the weapon. The unit paused precisely at the entrance of the vault, its singular optical cluster sweeping the cavernous space. Rowan knew the Quranic employed a complex sensor array that prioritized thermal and magnetic fluctuations over simple sight. He was damaged, hot with fever from the electric burn, and radiating the energy of panic. He was essentially a beacon. He held his breath, pressing the scorching skin of his right forearm against the cold steel of the pipe. The pain was secondary to the need to minimize his thermal signature. The Quranic unit, which Rowan identified from the old logs as a Grave Index retrieval agent, moved toward the shattered maintenance panel, ignoring Rowan completely. It was focused on the source of the communication disruption. Logic dictated that the agent secure the communication link before attempting retrieval. By time, the truth locked on his thumb drive was the only currency he had left. Rowan, moving with agonizing slowness, used his left hand to pry open the access panel on the manifold pipe he was hiding behind. This particular pipe carried residual condensation from the high-pressure equalization systems, a noxious mix of freezing brines and industrial lubricants. It was not meant to be vented. He located the main shutoff valve, a heavy brass mechanism. If he forced it open, the sudden extreme pressure drop would create a localized, blinding cloud of chemical ice vapor, masking his thermal signature completely. The Gravindex agent was now running a diagnostic on the dead comms panel, its movements sharp and precise. "Bryn, I need to know the transfer status. The comms panel here is dead. Use the encrypted channel, verbal report only." Rowan whispered into his helmet microphone, barely audible above the ringing in his ears. A sharp burst of static, then Bryn's voice, fractured and strained, cut through. "Rowan, the Koronic signal is overriding everything. I saw the extraction message. I have the data chip transfer status. It's stalled at 93%. The external signal interference is too heavy. 93%. 7% of the truth, the confirmation of Relith's institutional treachery, was still locked on world. He had risked everything to get the data off the platform, and the last mile had failed. The Gravindex unit shifted, its optical cluster rotating toward the manifold pipe. Having finished its diagnostic, it was coming for him. "I'm venting the pipe, Bryn," Rowan stated, his voice tight with fatal certainty. "It will mask the vault for 30 seconds. Find the remaining 7% of the transfer log, the key data points, the original alloy certification. Re-upload. Target Ambassador Thraxis directly. Use the emergency burst frequency. Rowan, that frequency is only for critical military deployment. It's highly traceable, and the command will pinpoint my location within 10 seconds of activation." "Then you have 10 seconds to get out, Bryn. I'll give you 30 seconds of cover. Don't waste it on me. Get the proof out." He braced his left shoulder against the cold pipe and positioned his right hand, the burned, deadened limb, on the brass wheel. He didn't have the strength to turn it safely, but he could jam it. The Gravindex agent began to stride toward the pipe, its pace slow, deliberate, and entirely assured. Rowan felt the pressure building in his lungs. "I am the alloy. Don't cheapen me." He didn't turn the wheel. He slammed his entire body weight, the functional strength of his left side, into the locking mechanism. The aged brass screamed in protest, not turning cleanly, but shearing violently. The release was instantaneous and deafening. A high-pressure jet of super-chilled brine exploded outward, instantly transforming the vault into a swirling blizzard of chemical ice. The sound was a terrifying, continuous scream of escaping pressure. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than 3 seconds. Rowan was engulfed. The freezing mist hit the electrical burn on his arm like a million needles, forcing a gasp of raw, searing pain. His visor immediately fogged over, rendering him completely blind. "Venting initiated," Rowan yelled into the comms, hoping Bryn could hear him over the catastrophic noise. "Go, now." He used the precious 15 seconds of chaos. He stumbled away from the pipe, trying to triangulate the Gravindex agent's position based on where it had been standing. He knew the Koronic relied on perfect sensor data. He had given them perfect noise. He fumbled with the data drive clipped to his side. He didn't have a receiver to broadcast the remaining 7% of the data. He was trapped. But then, the intense cold, a consequence of the intentional infrastructural neglect of the Relithian system, gave him the answer. He remembered the old analog scanner he had dropped in the maintenance tunnel, the heavy antique device designed to ignore digital noise and map substructural power flows. It was essentially a powerful, localized magnetic induction beacon. He had to get back to the collapsed passage. He had to retrieve the scanner and use its raw, unstable magnetic field to force the remaining data out. Rowan moved toward the open vault door, the icy chemical air burning his lungs. He was blind, deafened, and running on residual power. He had 20 seconds left before the brine dissipated and the Koronic agent's sensors adjusted to the cold. He shoved his foot into the thick pile of rubble left by the passage collapse, feeling the rough texture of pulverized concrete. He was going back into the toxic slurry. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, a dense thump from directly behind him, impossibly close. The Gravindex agent had adjusted its thermal calibration, using the extreme cold to isolate the single point of heat. Rowan pivoted, trying to swing his damaged right arm out as a shield, but the Quranic agent was too fast. It moved not with violence, but with focused, overwhelming mechanical pressure. A single articulated black finger pressed against the back of Rowan's neck, finding the precise pressure point where the cervical spine met the cranial nerve cluster. Rowan's entire body went instantly numb. The world dissolved into spinning, blurred color. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. He was a statue of pure, frozen pain. The Grave Index agent did not administer the killing blow. It was an extraction unit. It simply neutralized the target. Then, the agent's synthesized voice, cold and dry, filled the silence within Rowan's helmet comms. It spoke not to him, but to its distant command ship. Communication log, Grave Index, Ethelred Command. Subject, retrieval of Terran unit fell. Status, target neutralized and secured. Data drive located and confirmed. Transfer of remaining Terran data now authorized. Analysis, observation of Terran unit. Bryn Halstead confirms initiation of secondary, high-priority broadcast on emergency frequency. Data corruption is anticipated, but the act itself confirms calculated institutional sabotage. Proceeding with immediate extraction. The Grave Index agent, holding Rowan upright like a broken puppet, paused, its head tilted slightly toward the ceiling of the vault, listening to the incoming data from Bryn's last desperate transmission. A moment of absolute silence followed, heavier and colder than the brine mist. Then the Quranic agent moved its head toward Rowan. Its optical cluster suddenly focused not on thermal data, but on the raw, open fear in Rowan's eyes. Correction. The transmitted data package does not contain expected financial or political logs. The agent's voice was utterly devoid of emotion, yet the analysis was a profound shock. The remaining 7% of the Terran data is a schematic, not of the alloy failure, but of the deep core geothermal pressure array, annotated with structural recommendations for intentional, catastrophic failure. Rowan's mind, spinning with carbon dioxide poisoning and physical shock, struggled to grasp the meaning. Bryn hadn't sent the final proof of the past failure. She had sent the blueprint for the next failure. Further analysis. Terran Unit Halstead did not send proof of institutional betrayal. She sent a threat. This schematic, if utilized, would trigger the immediate, irreversible implosion of the Relithian planetary core, resulting in a 3 Sigma extinction level event for Sector 47 Gamma. The agent paused, processing the illogical magnitude of the threat. The hegemony feared Terran unpredictability, but this was beyond unpredictability. This was pure, focused, suicidal malice. The agent released the pressure point on Rowan's neck. Rowan fell slumped against the pipe, the ability to move flooding back into his paralyzed limbs with painful force. He realized the Quranic agent had paused the extraction. It needed a translation of this existential threat. Why? The Grave Index agent synthesized, its voice sharp with incomprehension. Why would a species deliberately encode its own planetary destruction into a defense mechanism? Rowan forced himself to breathe the thick air, the sudden, terrible understanding clearing the fog from his mind. Bryn hadn't been trying to expose the corruption. She had been trying to stop the extraction. She had escalated the situation to a full, civilization-ending gambit. "It's not a defense mechanism," Rowan choked out, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's the deterrent. It's what you get when you institutionalize betrayal. We'll take the whole damned world with us, before we let you have the truth." The Grave Index unit turned away from Rowan, its focus entirely on the new data. Alert. Terran military assets responding to high-priority emergency frequency transmission. Relithian tactical unit deployed from 5 different vectors. Resistance is imminent. The Quranic agent didn't respond to the threat of the Terran military. It responded to the threat of the extinction event. Advisory. Planetary core implosion is an unacceptable metric deviation. All tactical protocols suspended. Immediate neutralization of the source of the data, Terran Unit Halstead, is now mission priority 1. Rowan watched in horror as the Grave Index agent activated a propulsion field, and shot vertically up the exhaust shaft, disappearing toward the surface in a silent, blinding jet of plasma. It was not coming for him. It was going for Bryn. He had survived the betrayal of his command, survived the drones, survived the Quranic extraction, only to be left behind while his only ally was designated for silent, lethal termination. He was alone, alive, and holding the magnetic key to the truth, while his sacrifice had just condemned the one person who believed him. The plasma signature of the Grave Index agent faded instantly, leaving behind a cold vacuum of sound and a residue of burnt ozone that stung Rowan Fell's throat. He was dumped back into the physical world, the paralysis replaced by a violent, shaking tremor that rooted him to the spot. The cold metallic pipe dug into his spine, and the searing, aching throb in his right arm was a brutal reminder that he was still bound to the physical realm. He was alone, alive, and holding the magnetic key to the truth, while his sacrifice had just condemned the one person who believed him. The weight of that failure was immediate and crushing. It was not the failure of the alloy or the failure of the system. It was the failure of his own judgment. He had driven Bryn toward the ultimate act of desperation, demanded an impossible sacrifice, only to discover she was more fundamentally Relithian than he was, more willing to embrace the void if it meant denying the enemy. He had sought justice, she had sought total deterrence, and now she was running from an enemy that moved with the logic of industrial execution. His lungs seized. He gasped the thick, cold air of the vault, the carbon dioxide building in his blood, making his thoughts thick and slow. Mission Priority 1. Neutralization of Unit Halstead. The Quranic cared only for removing the existential threat, the illogical variable that threatened their sterile data set. They did not care about the betrayal he held on his thumb drive. They cared only that a human was willing to take down the planetary infrastructure. Rowan finally slid down the pipe, collapsing onto the concrete floor of the vault. The immense chamber, previously a symbol of security, now felt like a tomb. His suit's auxiliary power flickered, displaying 11% remaining. He was in darkness, deafened by the ringing, running out of air, and completely abandoned. The Relithian command would assume the Quranic had taken him. The Quranic had dismissed him as a non-priority. He was nothing but debris left over from a failed diplomatic exchange. The magnetic drive, the proof of the 60% downgrade, the evidence that had driven him across 80 meters of structural failure felt heavy and useless against his hip. He had aimed to expose the corruption, but all he had done was provide an alien empire with a psychological profile of Terran self-destructiveness and sign Bryn's execution warrant. He closed his eyes, fighting the black spots dancing in his vision. The internal tactical units were closing in on the platform, alerted by the emergency broadcast that Bryn had initiated. They wouldn't stop until they found her, or failed trying. This wasn't a manhunt. It was an exercise in data recovery and political cleanup. You got her killed, Rowan. The thought was a cold, sharp knife twisting in his gut, far more painful than the electrical burn. He hadn't just asked her to risk her job. He had asked her to risk her life for a cause, the truth, that ultimately mattered less than a single geological stability reading on an alien tactical screen. Rowan was an engineer, a man defined by physics and solvable problems. This was not solvable. He was stranded, his path of retreat cut off by tons of rock, his means of communication destroyed, and his remaining physical resources critical. He had hit the bottom of the well. His conviction, the furious need to right the wrong of his court-martial, felt hollow and petty compared to the massive, terrifying game Bryn had just played. He lay still for a long time, the only sound the high-pitched whine in his ears, letting the exhaustion and the cold sink in. He thought about simply lying there, waiting for the carbon dioxide to shut down his brain, allowing the Relithian command to find him dead, the data corrupted, and the problem solved. It was the logical conclusion to this catastrophic chain of events. He had tried, and he had fundamentally failed his only true ally. But then, the engineer in him, the stubborn Relithian alloy his father had preached about, began to fight back, not with morality or vengeance, but with raw, computational logic. Status: Unit Halstead in critical danger. Unit fell, Non-priority. Data integrity. Confirmed. Objective. Escape. The Grave Index unit had ascended the secondary exhaust shaft, a smooth, silent shot to the surface. Its mission was to neutralize Bryn, and it would do so with the focused, non-kinetic efficiency for which the Quranic were infamous. That shaft was his only way out, but it was heavily shielded, designed for single-direction atmospheric venting, not ascent. Rowan pushed himself up, his muscles screaming under the weight of his compromised suit, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, where the shimmering heat signature of the Quranic agent's residual plasma wash still clung to the edges of the shaft opening. The Quranic were precise. They were logical. They followed protocol. Rowan scanned the emergency access protocols etched into the vault wall, the protocols that had survived the power surge. The geothermal exhaust shaft was sealed by a standard 5-ton magnetic plate at the surface level, designed to prevent atmospheric backflow. A 5-ton magnetic seal. Rowan didn't have the strength or the power to deactivate it, certainly not with 11% battery remaining, but the Grave Index agent had just utilized high-power plasma thrust for its vertical ascent. The Quranic propulsion fields were generated by a dense localized magnetic disruption, a necessary inefficiency to bypass Terran gravity systems. Rowan's mind raced, piecing together the physics of the ascent. The agent had not simply gone up. It had forced a massive, momentary demagnetization of the shaft's infrastructure to prevent sticking. The Quranic always clean up their tracks. The agent would have reactivated the magnetic lock on the surface plate instantly upon clearing the shaft, restoring the seal against Relithian atmospheric pressure. It was procedural, but how fast was instantly? The Quranic definition of instantaneous was always based on their own processing speed, which was measured in nanoseconds. The agent had to prioritize the data transfer, confirming Bryn's threat, and then initiate the ascent. The relock sequence might have been fractionally delayed. Rowan's left hand, the functional one, fumbled with his belt, retrieving the thumb-sized data drive. The drive's casing was reinforced chromidium, designed to withstand high magnetic fields. It was the only uncompromised piece of tech he possessed. He needed a receiver, a transmitter, a focus point. The Grave Index agent had ascended through a strong residual magnetic field. The metal walls of the shaft, still warm from the plasma, would be imprinted with the agent's unique magnetic signature. A transient field, decaying rapidly, but present. Rowan forced himself to stand. He could not climb the smooth vertical shaft. He did not have the power or the time. But he didn't need to climb. He needed to ride. He needed to overload the final remaining magnetic footprint of the Quranic ascent, the lingering shadow of their specialized technology, and use it against the gravitational pull of Relith. It was utter madness. A tactic based on a 1-in-a-million confluence of technological failure and alien efficiency. He pressed the magnetic drive against the cold metal wall of the shaft, feeling for the faint, high-frequency hum of residual magnetism. There it was, a barely perceptible buzz, quickly fading back into the natural gravitational pull. He had to get the archaic analog scanner, the heavy, magnetic induction beacon he had dropped in the rubble. It was the only thing capable of generating a powerful enough localized field to amplify that fading Quranic signature. He turned toward the collapsed passage, the wall of rubble and slurry that had nearly entombed him. The air in the vault was growing dangerously thin, heavy with the smell of his own failing body. He had maybe 2 minutes before he lost consciousness. Rowan stepped back to the lip of the collapsed tunnel entrance. The effort to retrieve the scanner would surely kill him, burying him in the unstable debris. But Bryn was out there, fighting against a perfectly optimized alien hunter. I am the alloy. He took a deep, desperate breath of the foul air, tasting the metallic tang of carbon buildup. He would go back into the toxic neglect, retrieve the tool, and bet his entire survival on the arrogance of alien procedural logic. He stepped over the lip of the vault, plunging back into the dark, wet rubble. His boot slipped immediately on the oil-slicked rock. He fell hard, his damaged right arm slamming against a piece of jagged rebar. A low, ragged cry tore from his throat, muffled by the sheer density of the debris. He clawed through the slurry, digging frantically for the scanner. His functional left hand closed around the heavy, cold brass of the antique device. Victory. But as he pulled the scanner free, a sharp, cracking sound echoed from the structure above. Not the natural groaning of the rock, but the sound of heavy equipment being utilized in the access tunnels above the collapsed section. The Relithian tactical units were not fooled for long. They had detected the localized seismic instability and realized that Fell was likely trapped beneath the collapse. They were deploying heavy structural drills not to rescue him, but to breach the vault and retrieve the data, regardless of collateral damage. Rowan knew the sound. In less than 40 seconds, the drill would pierce the roof of the vault, and they would send down shock troops to clean up the mess. He dragged himself back into the vault, clutching the magnetic scanner. He was soaked, bleeding, and breathing heavily. He looked up the immense black expanse of the vertical shaft. He didn't have 40 seconds. He had to attempt the ascent, now. He secured the heavy magnetic scanner to his chest plate with a frayed strap, positioning it directly over his heart. He jammed the data drive into the scanner's ancient auxiliary port, forcing the raw data to become the magnetic pulse itself. Then, using his last flicker of suit power, he activated the scanner, overriding all safety protocols. The device did not whine. It screamed, a raw, high-frequency magnetic shriek that caused every loose piece of metal in the vault to rattle violently. The raw energy surged through Rowan's body, causing intense, localized burning on his chest, threatening to fry the organs beneath the plate. He threw his good arm against the metal wall of the shaft, forcing his body into contact with the residual Quranic magnetic footprint. The fusion of the two fields, the ancient Terran magnetic pulse and the residual alien propulsion field, did not create a controlled effect. It created chaos. Rowan felt a terrifying, agonizing lightness. He was suddenly pulled upward, not by controlled lift, but by a violent, stuttering magnetic recoil, slammed against the cold metal wall of the shaft. He was moving, but wildly out of control, a piece of industrial debris caught in an electromagnetic storm. Up. Faster. He heard the heavy grinding sound of the Relithian drill piercing the outer layer of the vault roof 30 feet below him. The ceiling above him was still sealed by the 5-ton magnetic plate. If the Quranic agent had relocked it, he would hit it at impossible speed, crushing himself into a smear of metal and flesh. If it was still fractionally demagnetized, Rowan slammed into the roof plate with a violent, jarring impact that knocked the breath from his lungs. The impact was not solid. It was a terrifying, momentary friction, followed by a sudden, sickening release of pressure. The 5-ton plate had not been fully sealed. The Quranic definition of instantaneous had provided a window of maybe 20 milliseconds. Rowan shot through the exhaust shaft, propelled by the violent discharge of the magnetic recoil, soaring toward the surface of Relithian platform, exposed to the cold, harsh light, carrying the blueprint of his world's destruction. He had won the ascent, but he was a dying man on a trajectory he could not control. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The recoil was not smooth thrust but raw, kinetic punishment. Rowan was thrown upward, not guided, but magnetically rejected by the shaft infrastructure. The violent magnetic field he generated with the ancient scanner locked onto the residual Quranic wash, turning the 20 milliseconds of alien procedural delay into a brief, screaming catapult. His body slammed repeatedly against the corrugated metal walls, each impact a jarring, bone-deep tremor. The shriek of the overloaded scanner was deafening, a high-frequency whine that fused with the agonizing burn radiating from his chest plate. The scanner housing began to melt, the brass alloy distorting and sputtering white-hot plasma that vaporized sections of his already compromised suit. He felt the cold shock of depressurization against his right shoulder, followed by the sticky warmth of fresh blood mixing with oil. Below him, the Relithian drill punched through the vault ceiling with a heavy thumo, a sound that echoed the system's fury and its need for immediate, total suppression. Shock troops were flooding the vault floor, too late to capture the data, too late to secure the asset, but perfectly positioned to clean the debris. Then, the final explosive impact against the surface plate. The air barrier shattered with a noise like tearing sheet metal, and Rowan was spat out onto the cold, wind-swept surface of the geothermal platform. Gravity reasserted itself instantly, pulling him down onto the reinforced grating from a height of 40 feet. He hit the ground hard, a tumbling crash of heavy metal, shredded composites, and shattered glass. The magnetic scanner, his lifeline and weapon, ripped free from his chest strap, sparking viciously as it hit the ground. It bounced once, then detonated internally, the overload fusing the delicate components into a useless lump of molten slag. The tactical display on his visor, already cracked, went completely blank. Blackness, silence, save for the rhythmic, desperate gasping of his own failed lungs. He lay still, blinded, deafened, and completely exposed to the harsh Relithian atmosphere. The wind, which habitually tore across the extraction zones, was a physical blow against his prone body. Slowly, agonizingly, the world returned. The ringing in his ears abated, replaced by the relentless howl of the acid wind. His vision cleared enough to reveal the fractured sky, a pale, sulphurous gray. He was on Platform 4, a sprawling industrial complex of gantries, towers, and automated crane rails. He was alive, the raw data drive still secured on his hip, but his suit was a ruin. The integrity rating would be 0. He had traded his career for the truth, his life for the magnetic push, and his physical health for an immediate exit. A triple failure of efficiency. A new sound cut through the wind. The high-pitched, insistent cycling of defensive armatures. The Relithian command had not sent foot soldiers to the surface. They had initiated a localized lockdown, relying on the system's optimized security grid. 50 meters to his right, a heavy anti-personnel turret rotated with hydraulic precision, its sensor cluster locking onto his heat signature. The barrel, a heavy ceramic rail, did not fire. It simply waited, humming with stored kinetic energy, relying on the logic of deterrence. It needed a verbal authorization code, a human order, to initiate lethal force. Rowan pushed himself up onto his functional left arm, spitting out a mouthful of blood and dust. He scanned the control grid in his mind, cataloging the sequence. The command would be relying on the delay inherent in human bureaucracy. A team leader would have to confirm his identity and then manually override the stand-down protocol. That would take perhaps 20 seconds. He needed those 20 seconds. He started crawling toward the nearest piece of cover, a massive, corroded geothermal condenser coil. Every movement sent shards of white-hot pain shooting through his broken right arm. Where is Bryn? He forced his failing vision to scan the wider perimeter. The Koronic agent, the Grave Index unit, would have prioritized the target. Bryn Halstead, the rogue operative, the one who tried to delete the infrastructure. He saw the light. It was not the flashing blue of Relithian emergency lights, but a sharp localized distortion in the air, approximately 300 meters away, near the primary cooling vent stacks. A shimmering heat haze, concentrated and unnatural, like staring at air over a 1,000-degree furnace. That was the signature of Koronic plasma propulsion. The Grave Index unit was engaging. Rowan reached the condenser coil, pressing his back against the cold, vibrating metal. He drew in gasping breaths, feeling the corrosive atmosphere burn his exposed throat. The internal comms crackled, not the local Relithian net, but an open, unfiltered Koronic channel, accidentally broadcast due to the proximity of the Grave Index unit and the platform's heavily magnetized environment. Koronic log, Grave Index unit Ulzeth. Target lock. Unit Halstead, Terran Rogue. Target exhibiting specialized, highly unpredictable evasive maneuvers. Current location, primary vent stack, Beta. Action. Deploying localized gravity dampeners. Preparing kinetic neutralization. Rowan's blood ran cold. Kinetic neutralization. That meant the Grave Index agent was abandoning plasma fire, the method that had failed with the Gloomstalkers, and deploying a localized high-speed strike. They had adapted their tactics instantly, based on the data gleaned from marshals like Joran Vesper. The Koronic had learned to fight the Relithian way, with efficient, devastating physics, Bryn was a technician, an engineer. She wasn't trained for combat against an apex alien hunter optimized for structural disassembly. Rowan looked at the massive condenser coil beside him. It was 10 feet thick, made of layered, obsolete alloy, crisscrossed with heavy-gauge electrical conduit, Terran infrastructure from the colony's first cycle. It was clumsy, badly grounded, and fundamentally inefficient, but it was still functioning. The Relithian anti-personnel turret was still waiting for the human authorization code. 20 seconds. Rowan pulled the last functional piece of equipment from his belt, a spool of high-tensile insulated copper wire, originally used for thermal flux calibration, a tool so primitive it was beneath Quranic cataloging. He didn't have time to bypass the turret's lock. He had to overload the command chain. With his left hand, Rowan plunged the stripped copper wire into a high-voltage terminal on the condenser coil, creating a fierce, blinding arc of electricity. The crackle of the short circuit was immediate and violent, overwhelming his hearing. The surge, raw and dirty, did not travel toward the turret. It traveled up the institutional power grid, overloading the local substation's data filters. It was a digital scream of chaos, a denial-of-service attack launched with 2 feet of copper wire and 5,000 volts of uncontrolled power. The result was instantaneous. All automated systems on Platform 4 panicked. The lighting system cycled violently, plunging the platform into strobing darkness and blinding flashes of emergency red. The hydraulic systems groaned. The anti-personnel turret, starved of clean digital authority, entered a diagnostic loop, its targeting lights spinning uselessly. Rowan pulled the wire free, his hand smoking and raw, the acrid smell of ozone and burnt insulation filling the air. He had won a temporary silence from the system. Now, he ran. He ran toward the distortion, toward the flickering chaotic light of the confrontation 300 meters away, stumbling across the grated floor. His lungs burned, his legs screamed with fatigue, and the cold was sinking into his bones. He reached the edge of the vent stacks, a towering mass of exposed pipes and vents, shrouded in steam and the unnatural heat haze. He saw Bryn. She was moving with a desperate, fluid speed he hadn't known she possessed, weaving through the thick array of pipes. She was holding a massive industrial thermal torch, a cutting tool, using the bright, intense heat flare to try and disrupt the Quranic agent's visual and thermal sensors. The Grave Index unit, Ulzeth, moved like liquid physics. It wasn't running. It was gliding on localized gravitic pulses, silent and deadly. Bryn was trapped against a thick, corroded pipe marked Geothermal Transfer, Sector 5. She raised the torch for a blinding final flare. The Grave Index unit didn't shoot. It moved. A faint blue localized field, the gravity dampener, appeared briefly around Bryn's torso. Then, with a speed that defied Terran optics, a needle-thin kinetic spike erupted from the Quranic agent's limb, aimed not at her body, but at the pipe she was using for cover. The pipe did not rupture. It compressed violently. The sudden displacement of pressurized, superheated geothermal fluid was immense. The pipe exploded with a furious shriek, enveloping Bryn in a massive cloud of scorching, scalding steam and toxic geothermal runoff. The kinetic strike hadn't killed her. It had used the environment to turn the extraction platform into a pressure cooker. Rowan skidded to a stop, his vision momentarily obscured by the sheer volume of vapor. He heard the faint, high-frequency sound of the Grave Index unit retreating, its mission accomplished. The target was neutralized by the surrounding environment, clean, efficient, and irreversible. The Quranic had calculated the most economical method of termination. Rowan stumbled into the steam cloud, ignoring the blistering heat against his exposed skin. He found Bryn slumped against the ruptured pipe, her body twitching, half submerged in the toxic fluid that was dissolving her suit composites. The torch had fallen from her grip. Her eyes were open, wide with shock, staring up at the steam-choked sky. She was barely breathing. Rowan knelt, reaching out his trembling, burnt left hand. "Bryn," he choked out, his voice a raw whisper. She didn't look at him. She looked past him, her eyes fixed on something higher, something only visible in the flashes of the strobing industrial lights. Rowan followed her gaze. High above the platform, massive orbital defense batteries operated by the Relithian Command, not Quranic forces, were rotating into position, not pointing outward, but inward. The tactical blackout he had caused with the electrical short circuit had not just disabled the anti-personnel turret, it had triggered the Systemic Integrity Protocol. The Relithian hierarchy had decided that the loss of data and the presence of foreign, hostile agents, the Quranic, on the platform, constituted an unacceptable risk to the greater network. The final, absolute solution. "They're glassing the platform, Rowan," Bryn whispered, the words bubbling out, heavy with geothermal fluid. Her voice was weak, but the recognition was crystalline. "Total cleanup. They can't risk the hegemony accessing the full extent of the alloy failure data." The irony was crushing. He had fought his way to the surface to expose the corruption, only for the corrupted system to decide its own destruction was preferable to its exposure. The cost of their internal political betrayal was now the annihilation of all life and data on Platform 4. Rowan looked down at the small damaged data drive secured on his hip. He still held the truth, the physical proof of the crime, but the system had enacted the ultimate defense, the deletion of the entire crime scene. He looked at Bryn, her life draining away due to the elegant brutality of the Quranic agent, an action facilitated by the Relithian systemic failure he had tried to expose. A low, subterranean hum began, the sound of the orbital batteries priming their main charges. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the first strike. Rowan yanked his mangled right arm free from the suit lining and pressed his fingers against the throbbing pulse point on her neck. Nothing, just the cold, toxic slurry. He closed his eyes, the roar of the incoming fire already beginning to deafen him. He was trapped on a ticking bomb, his evidence rendered meaningless by the system's final, terrified act of self-preservation. He was alone, standing on the precipice of his world's engineered collapse. He had escaped the ground, only to face the sky. Then, from the darkness beyond the blast zone, something moved. Not the gliding perfection of the Quranic, or the clumsy, hydraulic urgency of the Relithian systems. A light, a small faint beacon of thermal energy, cutting across the heavy, corrosive winds. It was moving too fast to be a standard Relithian transport, and too low to be orbital. It was an unregistered, heavily shielded shuttle, hugging the atmospheric turbulence, ignoring the incoming fire and the systemic lockdown. It was descending toward Platform 4, seeking a landing zone. Rowan looked at the small light, then down at the ruined body of Bryn Halstead, the political cost of his short-sighted quest for justice. He had the data, but he had lost his world and his only witness. He reached down and pried the industrial torch from Bryn's grasp. It was cold, inert, but still heavy with the weight of her final, futile defiance. Rowan staggered toward the perimeter edge of the platform, the geothermal runoff soaking his boots, the final countdown of the orbital strike ringing in his ears. He aimed the torch out into the toxic haze, not as a weapon, but as a marker. He had the truth. Now he needed a means of delivery. He activated the torch's remaining fuel cell, creating a massive, momentary plume of hot, blazing light against the backdrop of the dying Relithian colony. He stood on the edge of the abyss, a silhouette against the coming fire, waiting for the dark shape descending from the poisoned sky. The dark shape descending from the poisoned sky was not a rescue vessel. It was an armored parasite, a low-profile courier craft designed for atmospheric turbulence and minimal thermal signature. It dropped onto the grating with a brutal lack of grace, its landing gear slamming down hard enough to send metallic shivers through Rowan's bones. A side hatch hissed open, deploying a short, narrow ramp. The air spilling from the cabin was cold, recycled, and clean, a stark, sudden contrast to the sulphurous burn of Platform 4. Rowan stumbled up the ramp. He did not look back at the towering mass of vent stacks, nor at the body of Bryn Halstead, already half dissolved in the chemical slurry. There was no time for ritual, only for logistics. The interior of the courier was cramped, functional, and devoid of personalized touch. The pilot, a gaunt, heavily scarred man whose face was illuminated only by the faint green glow of the navigation screen, did not turn around. He merely spoke, his voice dry and devoid of inflection. Sit. Strap in. 72 seconds to kinetic engagement. Rowan found a restraining harness and forced his bruised, shattered body into the seat. His suit was weeping corrosive fluid and blood. He unclipped the small data drive from his hip and placed it carefully into a shielded slot provided between the seats. A slot clearly designed for high-value contraband. The pilot ignored the action, his fingers dancing across the controls, optimizing their egress vector against the incoming orbital fire. The ascent was not smooth. It was a controlled fall upward, a violent evasion strategy that pressed Rowan hard against the webbing. At the 60-second mark, the low subterranean hum that had been building on the platform reached a profound, sickening resonance. "Hold tight," the pilot said, the words barely audible over the roaring strain of the sublight engine. "System integrity protocol engaging. Relith command is very tidy." Rowan turned his head toward the viewport. Relith's sky, normally a mottled gray canvas, was ripped open by 3 descending streaks of white-hot plasma, the orbital strike from the defense batteries he had seen mobilizing. They were not aiming for a surgical strike on the core facility. They were aiming for area denial, total sterilization. The first kinetic impact was silent, absorbed by the vacuum of the high atmosphere, but the shockwave that followed was a physical blow to the small courier. The craft shuddered violently, thrown laterally by the sheer atmospheric displacement. Rowan felt the residual energy from the blast, a searing phantom heat on his already scalded skin. He looked down at his ruined right arm, dangling uselessly. The agony was distant now, buffered by sheer exhaustion. He was no longer an engineer fixing a flaw. He was the defect the system failed to contain. "Analysis," the pilot stated, his eyes never leaving the navigation display as they broke through the turbulent layer. "Platform 4. Total loss. Approximately 10,000 personnel designated collateral deletion. Data recovery estimate 0%. Command is satisfied." Rowan closed his left hand. The copper wire he had used to short-circuit the entire platform still clutched in his palm. A smoking, blackened artifact. The official narrative would be catastrophic. Sudden structural failure due to chironic sabotage. The alloy failure, the corruption, the intentional endangerment, all buried under a kilometer of fused rock and the scorched signature of a massive tactical cleanup. "The data is secure," Rowan managed, his voice hoarse, scraped raw by the geothermal steam. "Data is merely potential, Fel," the pilot replied, finally looking over, his expression grim. "It only holds value when it can be transmitted through a stable channel. You have bought a ticket out of this system, not a victory lap." Rowan watched Relith shrink, becoming a small, angry marble of churning, toxic clouds. He had traded 10,000 lives for a 32-gigabyte encryption file containing proof that 10,000 lives were always considered expendable. The true gravity of the conflict was never in the external threat of the chironic hegemony. It was in the human capacity for internal calculated self-destruction, an efficiency the chironic found both baffling and fascinating. "Where are we going?" Rowan asked. The pilot checked a manifest on his screen. "The Outer Rim. Station 307, neutral space. They pay well for clean data, the kind that destabilizes major economic powers. I don't want payment." The pilot offered a cold, mirthless smile. "Everyone wants payment, Fel. Yours is the anonymity that keeps you alive. You are now a ghost in the hegemony's index, living off the bounty of your own corporation's shame. You traded your career for this drive, and your friend for the 30 seconds it took to secure it. You are compromised goods. The data is your passport." Rowan peeled the remnants of his cracked visor away. The thin plastic fractured further, falling into his lap. A spiderweb of failure, just like the image that started his descent into the chasm of Val. He remembered the pressure down there, deep below the toxic crust, fixing the fissure that shouldn't have been there, the heavy, constant weight of the mountain pressing down on him, the stench of burnt iron and sulfur. He had believed that if he could just stabilize that one structural flaw, if he could expose the systemic betrayal, he could find absolution, penance for the court-martial that destroyed him. He had sought justice through documentation, but the system, in its final, elegant cruelty, had deleted the entire context. leaving the documentation meaningless to anyone but the historian. He was now far above the planet, traveling toward the indifferent vacuum of the greater galaxy, yet the weight of the injustice felt heavier than the pressure of 290 sub-levels. The air in the cabin was cold, recycled and clean, yet he could still taste it. The sharp, bitter tang of bile amplified by the oxygen mixture. The signature odor of institutional self-destruction. He ran his left hand over the small, cold storage unit. The evidence was safe now, but safety did not equate to victory. Rowan looked out at the star-dusted blackness, the vast expanse indifferent to the small, toxic tragedy that had just unfolded below. He had risked everything to expose the fact that the human command structures were fundamentally designed for failure, prioritizing immediate fiscal gain over foundational stability. The Quranic didn't need to conquer Relith. They just needed to wait for the internal logic to run its course. His hands, scalded and trembling, released the drive. The weight of the Earth's crust had been replaced by the vacuum of space. He was a piece of debris, carrying the systemic flaw he failed to fix. He closed his eyes. Penance had been served, for the wrong crime. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science.